going to start out with Mark Brenman. He's going to present on the influence of civil rights and anti-discrimination in shaping transportation. And I'll go over his bio real quick. Mark is joining us from a company called IDARE, which is intelligent design through automation, research, and experience. He's a former executive of the Washington State Human Rights Commission. He's a senior policy advisor for civil rights at the USDOT. He's been a division director of the Office of Civil Rights with the U.S. Department of Education. He's co-authored a number of papers. The Right to Transportation, Planning as If People Matter, Governing for Social Equity, When Hate Groups March Down Main Street, Community Response to Neo-Nazi and Extreme Right-Wing Groups. Editor and writer for Religious Diversity in the Workplace. The number of papers that he's written is our Social Equity Impact Assessment, Environmental Justice in Indian Country, Diversity in the Legal Profession, Reducing Minority Health Disparities, Reducing Police Violence. Advisor, he was an advisor at the City Project of Los Angeles. He was with the Diversity Standards Task Force, an instructor with the Young African Leaders Initiative, a member of the Equity Committee of the Transportation Research Board, a former member of the Native American Transportation Issues Committee with TRB, as well as a consultant and an expert witness on transportation equity legal issues. So with that, I will hand it over to Mark.
Good morning. Transportation systems influence how, where, and how well we move, socialize, live, and work. However, in a long history prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, transportation planning, design, and decisions were often made with little regard to their adverse impact on vulnerable, marginalized, and traditionally discriminated against communities. Today's anti-discrimination laws encourage and require transportation agencies, systems, and providers to minimize and avoid such impacts and ensure access to many forms of infrastructure. Current discussions of environmental racism have renewed an emphasis on such matters. For example, the new edition of TR News from the Transportation Research Board has articles on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the transportation field. The transportation system has helped shape civil rights laws. For example, bus lines in the South used to be segregated.
Mark, we can't see your presentation. Can you share your screen, please?
There is no presentation to share.
Oh, okay.
You're just going to have to listen. The Freedom Riders helped shape the modern civil rights movement. The famous 1896 Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson that supported separate but equal was a railroad case. Another big influence on transportation on civil rights is built infrastructure such as freeways that divided communities by race starting in the 1950s, which helped destroy some African American neighborhoods and still impede integration. These freeways point out the problem of sunk investment, literally of concrete, asphalt, and steel, and the difficulty of making changes and correcting past errors, discrimination, and racism. The errors and their vestiges create a burden on the present and challenge what can be done. These possible remedies are part of the current reparations discussion. Here are some takeaways from my presentation. A variety of federal and state laws require affirmative steps by those in the transportation field. Transportation is strongly related to key elements of civil rights law. The prohibition on the private attorney general approach to enforcing civil rights law is still bedeviling advocates and challenges federal agencies because they have to use a different method of proof. The disparate impact method of proof is discrimination that results from program administration or facially neutral practices that have the effect of disproportionately excluding or harming members of a protected class. Civil rights laws are generally enforced through filing administrative complaints with federal and state agencies and lawsuits. The ultimate tool to force compliance with civil rights is to withhold federal funds from a non-complying entity. However, this is almost never done, in part because it would deprive the ultimate beneficiaries of the aid. Federal agencies will almost always try to bring the recipient back into compliance with the law. The current financial crisis in transportation brought about by the pandemic and ensuing economic collapse creates many problems for us. Like any crisis, there are also opportunities. Hopefully, post-pandemic transportation can be recreated in a more equitable way. Some questions include, historically, how has transportation been used to advance systemic racism? What are the meaningful changes that leaders in transportation need to take to advance racial equity? The Biden administration has opened up this discussion through US DOT equity efforts and a series of equity and diversity executive orders, including ordering federal agencies to conduct equity impact analyses. For example, US DOT issued a request for information on the subject, and at a micro level is reviewing a Texas highway expansion project for potential civil rights and environmental justice concerns. It's ordered Texas to stop until the review is complete, which is highly unusual. I've also written a paper on equity impact assessment, which I can provide to you upon request. So here are some general principles to avoid civil rights problems in transportation. Know the demographics in your service area, down to the level of disaggregation by race, ethnicity, disability, language use, income, and poverty level. Make connections in those communities. Have advisory committees with representation from them. Conduct community vulnerability, environmental justice, and community impact assessments. Each plan, study, or review by a government agency or recipient of federal financial assistance should include the following elements: a clear description of what's planned, an analysis of the impact on all populations, including people of color and low income, an analysis of available alternatives, the inclusion of people of color, low income, and disability populations in the study and decision-making process, and an implementation plan to address concerns identified in the equity analysis. We need to take into serious consideration community needs, wants, and desires. How well are the communities served, especially compared to other communities? We need to develop alternatives through working with those communities. We have to make sure that we're in compliance with the assurances of compliance that all grantees have signed with US DOT when they receive grants and contracts. In addition to the federal requirements, some states, such as California, have more stringent civil rights laws and regulations than the federal government. The concept of transportation covered under federal law includes some modes that many don't even consider transportation, such as pipelines. In addition, some interest areas are very fast changing, such as LGBT rights. We have to provide services in a fair and equitable way, lower barriers and not create new ones, avoid segregating people by race, ethnicity, and disability, and provide remedies for past discrimination. Even more extensive remedies, such as reparations, are under discussion in many places today. A few cities have already instituted such reparations programs of a variety of types. There is no one definition of what they consist of. Transportation interacts with other forms of infrastructure, such as housing, healthcare, education, employment, and recreation. These all interact to keep people separated, and transportation is the glue that can hold them together. Assertions of inequitable modal investment have long been voiced by transportation users, civil rights advocates, and transportation advocates. These issues are often litigated and highlight disparities in funding between systems heavily used by affluent white suburban users and those mostly used by relatively poor urban users. Prohibited discrimination includes denial and inferior benefits and services, segregation, and treating a group differently because of race, color, or national origin. The federal courts have defined these criteria to include limited English proficiency and accent based on national origin and race. Civil rights issues also arise in highway construction and displacement, where there have been allegations of replacement housing being provided for whites, but not for people of color. In addition, a recent study showed that houses occupied by blacks are appraised at far lower amounts than houses occupied by whites, even when they are in the same neighborhood. We've also recently heard a lot about the 1921 situation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with destruction of the Black Wall Street neighborhood. The neighborhood was rebuilt, but was destroyed again by 4 highways and urban renewal starting in 1957. This goes to the issue of avoiding the vestiges and continuation of past discrimination. In addition, disability discrimination law generally requires lowering barriers to full participation, providing reasonable accommodations to people's disabilities, and providing full accessibility to information, including websites. Website accessibility is currently being litigated in federal courts across the country, but it's a wise bet to make your websites accessible now and not wait to be forced to at some later date. Ending projects can be as fraught with civil rights implications as starting projects. For example, the governor of Maryland canceled a light rail project planned for Baltimore City and County. This red line was supported by the African American community because it would provide access to jobs. Instead of pursuing economic development through infrastructure, investment, construction jobs, and transit-oriented development, the state decided to reject the development, saying it would be wasteful. Other current transportation civil rights issues persist, such as driving while black or brown, which is police officers stopping African American and Hispanic drivers at disproportionately high rates for imaginary or minor offenses. This resonates today because part of the present debate about realigning police services is getting police out of the traffic stop business. There are experiments with this taking place right now in places like Oakland and Berkeley, California. There are a whole bunch of other laws, executive orders, and directives that affect what we do in transportation equity, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, the Environmental Justice Executive Order, the Limited English Proficiency Executive Order, Native American Sacred Sites Executive Order, Indian Tribe Consultation, National Environmental Policy Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, National Historic Preservation Act. All of these have equity elements. Tribal governments, if you have any in your area, have to be formally notified of agency actions and proposals and consulted with. In addition, to make the situation even more complicated, each operating administration of USDOT has issued its own civil rights guidance. The guidance from the Federal Transit Administration is the most detailed and often referred to, even by civil rights advocates. Some modes of transportation have their own civil rights statutes, like the Air Carrier Access Act about disability access on airlines. In the 1970s, disability advocates tried to enforce disability civil rights laws with commercial airlines, and the courts found that airlines were not recipients of federal financial assistance. So Congress created a special act called the Air Carrier Access Act to fill the gap. And today, airliners are still not terribly accessible to many people with disabilities because to the airline companies, every square inch of space is a revenue-producing mile. The Environmental Justice Order creates issues to look at because of the confluence of environmental and civil rights law. Sometimes there are attempts to graft transportation onto the environmental review requirements under National Environmental Policy Act, and often this has not been terribly successful. An example is in 2004, a graving yard for construction of bridge parts was being built on the site of a Native American burial ground in Port Angeles, Washington. Although an EIS was prepared, it failed to notice the burial site. Of course, a controversy ensued with embarrassment for the State Highway Department. So if you're relying upon an EIS to cover environmental justice, make sure that all your subcontractors and contractors have done their due diligence. In this case, the archaeological subcontractor didn't look at maps in the 1800s and didn't even visit the local library to find out what had been on this site, such as a well-known Native American burial ground. At the scoping stage in the NEPA process, there should be adequate consideration of Title VI and environmental justice, including cumulative impacts of projects over time and geography, which includes looking at multiple projects together rather than one project at a time. Communities with larger proportions of low-income people bear more of a burden of transportation-related air pollution and noise, for example, especially because of their proximity to projects like freeways, airports, and railroad yards. Other civil rights issues include service and route changes in public transit, which how to address these are well covered by the Federal Transit Administration's guidance. There are only a few federal requirements that specifically protect the rights of low-income people. These include environmental justice and the Stafford Act about post-disaster aid. But even there are resistances today because there are currently allegations that FEMA has been distributing aid in a discriminatory way, and that is currently under review at various federal levels right now. One issue to bear in mind is that African Americans tend to own cars at the lowest level of any demographic group in the United States. And this affects plans for evacuation. And as climate change increases storm severity and rising ocean levels and storm surge, evacuation becomes more important. And of course, transportation is the key to evacuation. And so if an evacuation plan depends upon using privately owned vehicles, you're going to have disparate impacts on the African American community. This happened with Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and the surrounding area. I'm often asked if it's still true that African Americans own cars at the lowest rate of any demographic group in the United States, and the answer is yes, that is still true as of today. I won't discuss disadvantaged business enterprise because although that is often regarded as a civil rights issue, technically it's not and requires a special legal analysis called strict scrutiny by showing a compelling governmental interest, a history of discrimination, and exhaustion of less discriminatory alternatives. There are a lot of what are called intersectional issues, as civil rights people refer to them, where you have more than one kind of protected class that is affected. There are also national security issues, especially affecting airlines, where there can be increased scrutiny of certain groups and complaints by disabled passengers who get scrutinized because of canes, mobility devices, and wheelchairs. So here are some other examples of current civil rights issues in transportation. A large shopping mall in Beaver Creek, Ohio, was trying to keep African Americans away by increasing the requirements for the bus stops. Buses were bringing African Americans to the shopping mall, and they had exaggerated requirements for bus stops. The bus company wanted to transport people to the shopping mall and filed a complaint, and that was won through the Federal Highway Administration. Another current example is TNCs like Uber and Lyft's lack of accessible vehicles to people with disabilities. They're not technically covered by federal law, and yet there are complaints and lawsuits by people with disabilities, and there's some resolution occurring in that area. Another example is involved the Bay Area Rapid Transit in the San Francisco Bay Area and a spur it was building to the Oakland Airport. The spur passed over a largely minority community, and complaints were filed through Public Advocates, Inc. That were resolved through the American Readjustment Act. One of the major breakthroughs in transportation equity came about through Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Authority as long ago as 1996, which ended up requiring a huge $500 million investment in new buses by LAMTA, because LAMTA was directing its resources toward subways and light rail, which were ridden more by people of color, as opposed to buses, which are ridden more by people of people of color and low-income people. An issue we see today, and we're probably going to see more of, is economically regressive tolling of roads, lanes, bridges, and tunnels as surface transportation funding becomes more difficult. For example, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and the Lincoln and Holland tunnels in New York City have tolls of $19. Whereas in New York City, the minimum wage is $15 an hour. So that means a minimum wage worker has to pay over 1 hour's pay every day in tolls. And if they work in New Jersey, where the minimum wage is $10 an hour, they're paying almost 2 hours wages every day just to pay for those tolls. There are experiments occurring to link databases for the tolling, through the dynamic tolling, to other databases that provide proxy measures for low income, such as receipt of Section 8 housing, food stamps, Social Security disability income, home heating assistance, school lunch programs, earned income tax credit, and TANF. By linking such databases, waivers, exemptions, and discounts can be provided. One example of a current project being built as we speak that will inevitably have economically regressive effects on low-income people is California's high-speed rail. The fares have not been determined for it yet, but the chances are good that its fares will be about the same as regional jet, which means that lower income people will not be able to afford to take California high-speed rail system. It's very difficult under federal civil rights laws to stop a project before it has caused harm to a protected class. And this distinguishes, say, civil rights laws from the Endangered Species Act, where a project can be stopped if an endangered species is found in the way of the project. There are a lot of unsettled issues in transportation and civil rights. For example, my colleague Tom Sanchez has studied governance by MPOs and found that MPOs tend to overrepresent whiter and well-off suburban communities and represent less inner city and communities of color. The boundaries of MPOs can create problems, especially if public transit services follow those boundaries. There's also evidence of a spatial mismatch between Black workers and jobs, and an inability to get to jobs around airports and in the suburbs, which are job engines. Some transportation civil rights issues seem minor until they're examined closely. For example, right now it's popular in a number of places around the country to have Vision Zero initiatives. One of the problems with Vision Zero initiatives is that they require more police enforcement, means that there will be more interaction of the police with people of color communities at the very same time that people of color communities are complaining about damaging interactions with police. So there are opportunities to correct these problems and gaps that we've discussed today. The current infrastructure bill before Congress creates such an opportunity. There's big debate over how extensive the definition of infrastructure should be and how many social equity projects should be included in those one or two or more infrastructure bills. But infrastructure has always been, funding infrastructure has always been about social engineering and social policy. And I hope when we get to the question portion of the discussion, I can address some questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. And that's a good point. We'll have all the questions at the end, so hold on to your questions. Also meant to mention that Mark is joining us from Virginia, or from Maryland this morning. So thanks for that, Mark. Up next we have Lawrence Frank, who's with Atkins in Atlanta. And his presentation will be protecting transportation infrastructure from natural hazards. A little bit about Lawrence. He is a professional urban planner with leading Atkins Federal Planning Resilience and Recovery Group. With 27 years experience in resilience, he has extensive background assisting state, university, and local, tribal, and territorial officials reducing the risk to natural hazards through plans and grants. Recently, Mr. Frank led a project with the ARC to better understand the vulnerability of Atlanta's regional transportation assets to climate change and extreme weather. Earlier in his career, he assisted Boulder County with the development of a resilience plan for its transportation system to help prioritize future investments. To maximize the effect, Mr. Frank also has helped communities recover by implementing resilience plans after large hazard events like the city of Mexico Beach, Florida, Hurricane Michael, and Hurricane Matthew in the state of North Carolina.
Great. No, thank you, Robinson. Can everyone see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Let's see. All right, so thank you all. It's great to be here or be present. I know you're all in St. Simons. I kind of wish I was there too, but just came off vacation and just couldn't make it happen. But I did present on this last year to a degree, so I'm going to take a little bit different angle. But really what I'm here to talk about is I'm a planner, and how, Mark mentioned rising seas and greater floods, and that's really what this is about, my presentation. But it's really about how we can leverage emerging trends, which is the theme of this session, big data, better technology, how we can use that to deal with these issues. And this is just a recap of what happened in 2020. There were more billion-dollar disasters than any other year before. There were 22. There are a variety of them. You can see there were several hurricanes, wildfire, these large thunderstorms and derechas, which are like straight line winds across a long area, just had a tremendous impact. And the previous record of billion-dollar disasters was two of them, 22 last year in 2020. The previous record was 16 in 1 year in 2011 and 2017. So, a trend that's not a trend that's favorable. And also this year, we're already dealing with, there's been a tropical storm, there's a hurricane in the Pacific, but I think the big news is the extreme heat in the West, the dry conditions, the fires, and then just recently the flooding in Europe was pretty bad. So, a lot happening out there. This is another kind of snapshot of a longer period of time, showing where there's a deeper red color, more disasters. So there's a lot of, we're wrestling with this continually, and changing climate is driving part of this. So, not trying to be all doom and gloom, but it's something we have to deal with. Here's kind of going forward. This is from the National Climate Assessment. of 2018. This is kind of what's likely to happen in the southeast. We're looking at sea level rise, showing greater, this chart showing greater high tide flooding days, days with precipitation, the chart here at the top left, above 3 inches. You can see that it's basically increasing. So what does that mean? That means, and also we're dealing with greater urbanization in the southeast in general. So that means more impervious surface on the ground, and so that's contributing to greater flood risk too. So we're looking at these more intense storms, greater periods of drought also, which they kind of go hand in hand. Also, sea level rise is making it difficult for coastal communities. It's sort of a slow creeping type of thing, but it makes it harder to drain stormwater. In addition, it also obviously encroaches upon things like infrastructure and transportation infrastructure, which are usually some of the lowest lying places. Obviously, culverts going under them are low lying, so it's having a really big impact on our transportation infrastructure. So, just like we go to the doctor to try to figure out what our health is, try to detect things before they get to the point where it's a crisis. What kind of tools and what do we need to inform things like the planning process to make better decisions? Because you all know this. We make decisions today and we put infrastructure in the ground, and it's there to last. It's intended to last a long time. So how can we understand what future conditions are, know where our higher risk areas are and where they're getting likely to get worse, and how we change our policies and our project types, or at least incorporate resilience into that, so that we have infrastructure that will last for its useful life and be effective. So, going to go into a few examples of how this has been done. I know there's a lot of small print on this, but essentially what you're looking at is something we did for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. It's an urban coastal stormwater tool. And really, it's to help answer questions. The bigger question is, when is this system going to start to fail? This blue area on the left is the saltwater, and it's the hour-by-hour tidal flows. It incorporates this projected space. It gets to the stormwater system, which a lot of it is underground. There's an outfall system. There's manholes, but it's also calculating the rainfall that's coming down, and likely, if it's an area that's going to increase, looking at the changes in the overland flow that's going to go, along streets, over top roadways, and so it's really what the end result of this is. It's showing, multiple flooding sources, but it's really showing where the system is going to start to fail, or projected to fail, and so allowing the community to get ahead of the pain, so to speak, and then giving them time to adjust their stormwater system. We know there's just not unlimited resources, so at least this can help sort of prioritize the resources and get to where the worst issue may be. And this is, we did a kind of a case study in Hallandale Beach, Florida, which is right on the water, in Broward County, South Florida, and then one in Olympia, Washington, just for two different sort of areas to compare. But really what the tool allowed the city engineer and other department heads to see the risk results, where things were likely to change, and then that allowed them, these results, to align with their potential budgetary needs, put that into the capital improvements process so that they could have some time to get the funding they needed to make the infrastructure improvements for greater resilience. So it has a very practical use. And again, it's to help project ahead of time so that we can make policy and planning decisions and funding decisions today that are better equipped to deal with tomorrow's conditions. So next I'll talk about another tool that's sort of a master tool that Atkins has developed. And again, I'm the planner, on the planner side, so I have software modelers and some floodplain mapping staff that really do the work inside the tool, but I'm the one who helps, like, what kind of results do we want to get, or what kind of things do we want to measure, and then how do we use the results. But just a real quick rundown of what City Simulator does, or what it is. It's basically ArcGIS extension. So it's using a platform that's fairly well known and fairly common. It uses open source data. It has agent-based modeling, so it traces things down to basically the parcel level. It can evaluate multiple disciplines, so we can look at future growth, we can look at climate risk, we can look at traffic patterns, things like that, and then how they'll likely change to then kind of forecast future conditions. The nice thing about this too is it allows you to test some options. So if you wanted to say elevate a bridge that looked like it was getting in an area that was greater and greater flooding, you could show what that change was to that piece of infrastructure, and then the reduction in damage and disrupted trips. And we'll kind of see this in more detail as I get. But again, what it is at its core, it's a map-based decision support tool. So it's not going to make decisions for you, but it gives us information to better understand what the future is going to look like, or where our greatest vulnerabilities are going to be, and then that can help sort of pinpoint, where we should direct our efforts as far as resilience. And so sort of how it works. So just another way of sort of how this gets set up. You look at the vulnerability, sort of the status quo. You build a digital twin. You look at the climate influence changes, the weather, and if it's a coastal, the tide forecast. Create a baseline scenario, run the simulation, look at the results. If you want to look at adaptation measures, then you create scenarios like, hey, we're going to increase our, every road in the floodplain needs to be elevated another foot, or needs to be able to handle the 50-year storm instead of the 25-year storm. So then you can evaluate what that's going to look like. You can calculate, the losses avoided. So that's the nice thing about it. You can quantify the results. And I think that's very helpful to decision makers, to presenting to the general public. That's where I think there's a lot of value with this type of tool. Again, there's a lot of metrics, but I think, when you're talking about resilience, a lot of it gets into avoiding losses. And you can look at, different groups that are being affected, like a lower income may be more dependent on transit. So we can look at the impact on the transit. That's kind of what we did for the Atlanta Regional Commission. So different ways you can slice it. And then incorporating climate change. It's based on, accepted future forecasting, the global climate model, GCM, downscaling it for a local area, and then running lots of different scenarios to kind of get to where, kind of like when you see those hurricane tracks, the model starts to kind of hone in on the more likely projected path. So it factors in, these future changes. So again, it's helping to get ahead of this pain that can be this caused. We constantly hear on the news, like, I didn't know it could flood here, or the flooding is a lot worse, or the storm strengthened. There'll always be surprises, but this is a better way to anticipate what future changes are going to be. So these are just where the tool has been applied. Here's the Atlanta Regional Commission one, looking at the transportation network, the vulnerability of it, and then we drilled down to a pilot study. But I want to talk about what we did in Boulder County, because I think that one was also pretty, had some breakthroughs with how a tool can help. This is kind of getting into the outcomes that I think were most positive. So this is for Boulder County. It's an area that is both mountainous, and there's a more, sort of the high plains area, and it's where those two meet, and that's where the city of Boulder is, but there's mountain towns that are nestled in the Front Range. And so you have, from a risk point of view, you have wildfire, you have flooding, and you have increased flooding if it's after a wildfire because of the changes to the vegetation on the slopes and increased flows. So what Boulder County had already done quite a bit. So our challenge was to really evaluate what their actions and priorities were, and to see, using City Simulator to really pinpoint the vulnerable spots and see if we could add a richer view of what they're doing and evaluate their priorities. So what the tool helped do, and what was important to them, was where are going to be the biggest disruptors in the transportation network due to these future vulnerability. Disruptor is both the combination of the number of people that use that on a daily basis, that road segment, and then its risk and likelihood to be damaged, and therefore having people to find a different way to get to work or home. And so it really, and these are the top 10 right here in this table, but it really also helped identify the top, 3 bridges that were the top 3 that had the greatest, were going to have the greatest disruption. And that was used to help validate project funding from FEMA, which they were able to get. So again, this is sort of a snapshot, a profile of what was evaluated in Boulder, the impact on the building stock, transportation impacts, and then economic productivity impacts. A lot of it is in disrupted trips, flood damage directly to the infrastructure and facilities, and then building recovery plans, based on the level of impact to those. And then not in the map floodplain. So you start to see that it's not just occurring in the special flood hazard area, as we know, but we're getting into the quantification of how much outside the special flood hazard area, and also where. It's all spatially distributed. So again, we can make better decisions about where, dollars, grants to apply for, or investments to protect these areas. It founded that the road flooding was the biggest cause of disrupted trips, as opposed to workplace and home flooding. But it really kind of pointed to where you can get more value is elevating and hardening culverts, bridges, and roads is really the best way where you're going to get the greatest return on your investment, resilience-wise. So it helps really make those kind of decisions, which I think is really the real important value of the tool. And again, took into consideration the remoteness factor. What that means is like these towns and settlements in the mountainous areas, there's just not many ways in and out. There are very few. Sometimes there's only one way in and out. That's why, on the news after the 2013 floods in this area, you saw helicopters having to rescue people because they had the road they were dependent on was washed out. So, you know, the sign of remoteness factor, if this is the sole really primary route, it becomes more valuable. And so that kind of factors into disruption. So just other things to think about in a transportation setting. And then finally, you know, getting into these areas, pinpointing where the greatest disruptors are. And these bigger blue dots are sort of the highest levels of vulnerability, along with the level of either remoteness / how many users are using it. So you kind of get into this really better look at, you know, how valuable that segment is and then how vulnerable it is. So Boulder really led to a plan that helped with grant funding, that bolstered grant funding. They can use it going forward. The tool, you know, like the nice thing about digital products too is that they can be updated as we continue to get better information. So that's another plug for that, that type of tool, digital twins. So, but I'd like to just bring up another one that we did with a slightly different focus, but it gets into multiple transportation modes. This was in Vancouver, Canada. So it's on the coast of the Pacific coast, just north of Seattle. This is their port. But they didn't want to just look at the vulnerability to the port itself. They wanted to look at the whole logistics chain that leads to the port and then the inland distribution chain. Because, you know, all along those areas, you can disrupt the essential transportation function of the goods and sort of goods that come through that. So, you know, looking at things like the Western Pacific tropical cyclone forecasting, sea level rise, changes in climate, precipitation in that area, better to able to look at the vulnerable parts of this system, and then how it impacts cargo flows, and, you know, sort of again pinpoint along that whole route. So we're talking about basically thousands of miles, inland and overseas, where your biggest problems are likely to be, including the port itself. So again, it helps the port authority understand, you know, their facility vulnerability, but also how their operations could be disrupted. Because inevitably, resilience isn't preventing every single type of storm. There's always going to be a storm that exceeds, you know, what we're able to protect, the design level we're able to protect to. We've spent all the money in the world trying to protect every conceivable, you know, storm type, but there are certainly things within the you know, the facilities and the chain, the logistics chain, that are, you know, the maybe the most valuable link, or maybe the most vulnerable that you need to focus on, because sometimes one part of it could extend the disruption further, longer in time. So again, looking at what's most vulnerable and then what's most valuable to the functioning, and then looking at how you can bounce back faster if you are damaged, and then, you know, maybe some rerouting of the supply chain while you're fixing things. So again, getting into that operational element. Again, it was city simulator, but with a slight twist for a seaport. So again, it's a digital twin of the supply chain, looked at shipping lanes, rail corridors across Canada and into the US, looked at these different future climate features that were going to change the future risk, and also extreme temperatures. So we're seeing that now. Like Seattle had extreme temperatures that buckled part of the road network. So rail can be affected too by those extreme temperatures. So knowing where that's more likely to happen. And also, it helps to plan forward, because we're never going to have the perfect plan for every contingency, but the more we plan, the more we're able to improvise on those things we weren't expecting, and we have more knowledge of what's likely to happen to better deal with these future circumstances. So that really concludes. I know it's kind of a quick trip through these different tools, but I just want to give you an idea of how these can really help the planning process, and especially in transportation. We're currently doing some work with NCDOT that's just getting started. So, we're continuing to apply this to help out other partners and look at where some of their greatest vulnerabilities are and needs. But here's a couple of things if you'd like more information. We have a website set up. I can make these slides available to get these links, but we also have a couple of demonstration videos. And I'd like to thank you all and look forward to any questions.
All right. Thanks, Lawrence. All right, with that, we'll go right back out of state again up to Virginia for our next presenter, Louis Newdorf, excuse me. He'll be presenting on mileage-based user fees and their potential and issues they can resolve. So Lou is a principal technologist with Jacobs Engineering, and during his 40-plus year career, he has specialized in transportation systems management and operations and supporting ITS technologies. Other areas of expertise include various attributes of active transportation and demand management, and the integration and operation of corridor, freeway, and arterial systems. For the last 10 years, Lou's been focusing on the alternative approaches for funding the transportation system, including mileage-based user fees. And his work with this has included Oregon, California, and Utah. And he's currently the project manager for the Eastern Transportation Coalition's multi-state mileage-based user fee project. So with that, Lou, it's all to you.
Thank you all. Very quickly, a common question in virtual world. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to talk about not only what you've heard today, but what you're going to be hearing throughout the conference of transportation improvements and the like. I'm going to focus an emerging trend, potential trend, on how do we actually pay for all these wonderful things? How do we provide a sustainable transportation funding approach? Little disclaimer here, very quickly. Yes, I have been working on the concept of mileage-based user fees for nearly 10 years. I've had the privilege of being the project manager for the Eastern Transportation Coalition for the last 4 or 5 years. What I'm going to be presenting today are, in some cases, my opinion, not necessarily those of my clients, including the Eastern Transportation Coalition. So, some background. Why is there a problem? Well, let's start with the Highway Trust Fund, which is a major part of most state DOTs, particularly for capital improvements. As you can see from the chart on the left, about 82% of the Highway Trust Fund revenues comes from fuel taxes, federal fuel taxes. 18.4 cents on gasoline, 24.4 cents per gallon on diesel fuel. And while there has been generally an annual increase in these revenues, maybe 1 to 3%, you look at the chart on the right, the amount that is going in the gas tax per mile driven has been going down over the years, mainly because of the increase in the efficiency of the automobiles out there using the roadway. Of course, the other big problem has been inflation. The purchasing power of the federal gas tax has declined dramatically, particularly since 1998. The last increase of the Highway Trust Fund, the last increase of the federal gas taxes was 1993, but a portion of that went to pure deficit reduction. It wasn't until 1998 that all the gas tax revenues and fuel tax revenues went into the Highway Trust Fund. So since that high point of 1998, the gas tax has lost 57% of its purchasing power. So we are in something of a crisis for funding. The future doesn't look all that good either. Congressional Budget Office, as you can see, is projecting for 2029 11% reduction in federal gas tax revenues going to the Highway Trust Fund, 2% reduction in the diesel tax. That could change, particularly if the concept of electric semis takes off and the appropriate infrastructure for charging them quickly as they make their cross-state rounds. Our own projections look a little worse. If every car on the road in 24 is averaging 25, it's about a 10% reduction. But if every car on the road in 2040 is averaging the CAFE standards of 54.5, it's very close to a 50% reduction. Because of these issues with the highway trust funds and the diminishing revenues, in terms of purchasing power, many states have increased their state fuel taxes over the last decade. Almost all of them along the eastern seaboard have, as you can see in this map. Also, a number of these states have indexed their state fuel taxes. Some states index it to the cost of fuel, consumer price index, population, vehicle fuel efficiency, some combination. New Jersey and I think a few other states actually look at the deficit. There is a minimum requirement for their state transportation fund, and if they didn't make the revenues they needed last year, it's an automatic increase. So, the question becomes, well, that's simple. Why don't we just raise the fuel tax? Why doesn't the federal government raise the fuel tax like many of the states have? Well, as you can well imagine, that's been talked about a lot, even for this latest infrastructure bill that is under consideration. It never gets very far in Congress because at the end of the day, it's a tax. And our representatives don't like to increase taxes. It can be sort of the third rail for politics. So, but even if you raise the gas tax, there are some equity issues. As you can show, it's shown here, electric vehicles would end up still paying no tax, fuel tax for using the roadways. Hybrids would pay very little, while gas guzzlers would pay the most. And getting back to one of the items that Mark was talking about, as it turns out, low-income people tend to have low fuel efficient vehicles. So there's that whole issue to concern. So what we've been looking at is let's go from the gas tax to a mileage-based user fee. You'll hear this called RUC sometimes from road usage charge. You'll hear it as a VMT, the vehicle mileage tax. We try not to use that because that also is a planning term for billion vehicle miles of travel and the like. So it's very simple. Instead of basing the revenues based on how much gas you use, let's make it a user charge. Not unlike a utility, like electricity or water, that it's based on how many miles you drive. In many ways, the original intent of the fuel tax was a user charge. If you think about it, at least until about the mid-70s, all vehicles got pretty much the same average fuel efficiency. After the gas crisis of the early 1970s, many manufacturers started developing highly fuel-efficient vehicles. So we now have this wide gap. So maybe it's time to go to a mileage-based user fee. So very quickly, how might MBUF work? Well, at the center of all this is an account manager. Typically a private entity that is hired by the state. There's several out there. The coalition has used Azuga. Utah is using Movis. IMS has been involved in Oregon with some others. And there are more of these account managers getting into this field, including one that's the coalition is working with right now is Transurban. So anyway, the motorist, the account manager provides some sort of approach to collect the mileage. It goes to the account manager. They charge the MBUF, send the driver an invoice, and usually this would be automated via credit card. Then the account manager is responsible for transferring these funds to to the state, and of course the state is responsible for oversight functions, certification of the account managers, auditing, and the like. And this has been the way it has been done in all the pilots and a few of the existing systems today. Now, back when this really started, it's worthwhile giving a shout out to Oregon. Oregon really started this in the 90s. They did their first pilot in 96, and they came to the conclusion that technology wasn't ready. Fast forward to 2012, technology is available. They were the first ones to do a pilot. Washington State and California and Colorado have also done pilots. But if you notice, on the East Coast, not a lot happening. Well, the FAST Act actually started addressing this problem. They authorized grants for demonstrating user-based revenue mechanisms, the focus being to maintain future long-term solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. It provided $95 million over 5 years, and a 6-year has been added. It has not come out yet, but a 6-year has been added. A 50% match is required from the states or private partners. But the Eastern Transportation Coalition, working with several of the member states, have had, well, we've been awarded 5 grants. As I mentioned earlier, Jacob's project manager. Each grant we call a phase. This work has included passenger car pilots, which have included transportation stakeholders, a few legislators, a few media, and some general driving public. We've also had truck pilots, including the establishment of a motor carrier working group to help guide that, pilot evaluations through data surveys and focus groups, education and outreach, and also analysis of key MBUF issues, and there are a lot of said issues, which I'm going to talk about briefly. Anyway, come to looking at this today, there is a very different landscape geographically. The pilots done by the coalition have been included Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and North Carolina. Also, in addition, Oregon, to the Oregon system, Utah now has an actual system, and Virginia has legislation, and their system is supposed to take off July 1st of next year. So, another disclaimer, and I agree with this one, by the way. The coalition is neutral on whether MBUF is the ultimate solution. I mentioned that a lot of issues we still need to work out. But coalition and its members strongly believe that real-world data and experience is essential to finding an answer, which is in essence the whole point of the SDSFA program. So, let's go through, check time, oh, plenty. Let's go through some of the opportunities and some main issues with an MBUF approach. And the pilots that have been done, not only on the East Coast, but out in California, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and other states, really provide some very useful information and give us some ideas of how we should resolve these issues. Perhaps the first issue we're dealing with is a lack of understanding on the general public just on how transportation is funded. People recognize the importance of a smooth operating transportation system. It's how they go to the doctor, it's how they get groceries, it's how they go to get their kids to school. But most of them don't realize there's a funding problem. One of our team members, DHM, has done statewide surveys in 4 states. And the good news is anywhere from 61 to 79%, about easily 2/3 on average, rate highway quality is good or excellent. That's pretty good, because usually people, when it comes to public works type things, are complainers. At the same time, however, 68-76% of those same people believe that transportation funding is increasing or staying the same. So education outreach is a major issue. How do you convince the general driving public that there is a need to change the paradigm for how we do transportation funding when everything is fine, or at least it's perceived to be fine? Another issue is, how are we going to collect the mileage? Well, the technology is available, and also manual. Many of the pilots have used a plug-in device that goes into the OBD2 port. We are now seeing more and more vehicles have in-vehicle telematics, and we're beginning to see how that works. There's also looking at the possibility of getting information from insurance companies that offer use-based insurance. There will always be people that don't want their mileage reported, so there's the flat fee approach. And finally, a non-tech approach is an odometer reading. And there are a couple of ways to do that. One has been you just put in your mileage on an app, or you take a picture of your odometer. One of the things that particularly Hawaii is looking at, and we'll be looking at as well soon, is a number of states have mandatory safety inspections for all vehicles, annual or biannual. Well, why don't we take the odometer reading from that inspection and use that as the basis? It sounds great in theory. There are issues. Not in most cases, that odometer reading at the inspection station doesn't necessarily make its way to the DMV or the DOT. So there needs to be some changes to that process. There's even one or two states that I'm aware of that the inspection doesn't even have to have an odometer reading. And then there's the issue, well, if you do this on an annual basis, that could be a very big chunk of change that people have to pay out once a year. So how would you make that more of a monthly payment? But the key thing here is the technology and manual methods for work. One of the things that the coalition work has looked at is premium features and amenities. When you sign up, you get, in addition, we've always considered that sort of the proverbial sugar that helps the medicine go down. You can get a driving score. You can get you can get an email or a text if your battery goes below a certain amount. There are safe zones. We can draw a circle around a particular area, and if your teenage driver goes into that area, you immediately get an email. One thing on the driving score, my wife always loves to give me a ration on that one. I tend to accelerate hard, speed, and I brake hard. So my driving score is not the greatest. My wife is a great driver. Her score is usually around 100. And I never hear the end of that when we're both participating in a pilot. Here's the bad side of this. We did something different. We let people opt into it our last pilot. Only about a third of these participants really had an interest in them, but those that did like it and opt in really, so it is something to consider, but it is not a cure-all. Perhaps the most major issue is privacy and data security. This, in surveys, tends to be number one of the concerns with the MBUF approach. People are going to track me, they're going to know where I go, and when I went there, and of course with all the data breaches that have occurred over the last several years and hacking, will my information be safe? Well, some things you have to do. Define personally identifiable information and how it's going to be protected. One thing we're going to have to provide choice for how your mileage is reported, including at least one that doesn't have GPS, and also perhaps a manual method or even a flat fee. There has to be rules and regulations about how the data is handled by the account managers, how long can they keep it, prohibitions to actually providing or selling the data, the third-party entities. And we have found that participation in these pilots have reduced these concerns. In one state of the general public, the concerns was around 75%. After participating in the pilot, it went down to around 40-45%, which is a nice decrease, but there's still 40 to 45% out there. And as one legislator told us, if 45% of his constituents are concerned with privacy, we have to do more about that. So it remains a major issue. One of the issues that occasionally comes up is, well, with mileage fee, how will you track out-of-state mileage? Well, let's start with the premise that the current gas tax or fuel tax doesn't know whether you're in-state or out-of-state either. But this is an important issue, particularly from the East Coast perspective. Our 2019 pilot had close to 900 participants. Most of these were general public from Pennsylvania and Delaware. And as you can see in the map, during a 4-month period during the summer of 2019, these participants drove through 42 states, most of Canada, or at least the provinces that border the United States. And such, the total mileage, out-of-state mileage, was 13% of the total. We conducted a pilot during COVID last fall, and even then, when people weren't traveling as much, there was still about 9 to 10% out-of-state mileage. So what we may need moving forward is, if this becomes real, is some sort of a multi-state clearinghouse where each state selects one or more account managers. They provide the money and the supporting data to the clearinghouse, and then that clearinghouse provides the appropriate funds based on how the number of miles that were driven in each of those states. I should mention there is already something like that in place for interstate trucks. I won't get into the details, but there's the International Fuel Tax Agreement, which distributes fuel tax revenues, diesel tax revenues between states based on the number of miles interstate trucks drove in each state. There's also the International Registration Plan, or IRP, which does the same thing based on mileage, but for state registration fees. Equity and fairness is another major concern, and these fall into several different categories. One is, well, how about differences in urban, rural, socioeconomic, which I will say we haven't done. We've only started looking at that, but it's suffice to say that what we have found is that under the current fuel tax, low-income households pay a much greater percentage of their annual income on gas, and therefore also the fuel tax, than high income. Also, low-income households generally can't afford the higher fuel efficiency vehicles. That brings up, how do we treat high efficiency and low efficiency vehicles in an MBUF? And how about the general revenue contribution by cars and trucks? Let's talk about urban rural. We've done some studies, and what we are showing is that the difference relative to the fuel tax is not all that great. In general, urban areas, our drivers in urban areas would see a slight increase in their MBUF payments compared to the fuel tax, where rural areas would see a slight decrease in their MBUF relative to the fuel tax. This is with the same per mile rate being used by all households. The reason for that is, in general, rural households tend to have lower fuel efficiency vehicles. So another issue is how to treat high efficiency and low efficiency vehicles. All the pilots in this country today have used the concept of a single revenue neutral per mile rate. What that means is if your car gets the average MPG, which is right now nationwide around 23 MPG, you would end up paying the same amount in MBUF as you pay in fuel tax. If you have a low efficiency, you actually pay less. If you have a high efficiency, you would pay more under MBUF. And so the question has come out, should high efficiency vehicles pay the same per mile rate as gas guzzlers? In fact, when we've done our statewide surveys, we get contradictory opinions. One of the reasons for being against MBUF is that it's unfair to EV owners. They're going to pay a lot more, and they're doing their part to help the environment. At the same time, we get strong reasons for supporting MBUF is that people who drive EVs are not paying their fair share for using the roadway. So maybe we need something like a variable rate structure, something like shown on the graph to the right, where EVs would pay something that their per mile rate would be less than gas guzzlers. A lot of issues with that, potential issues with that we're just beginning to look at. Finally, we cannot forget that, yes, trucks make up about 9% of the traffic on the nation's highway system, but they currently contribute 42% of the highway trust fund through the fuel and the other excise taxes that we're subject to. So you can't treat trucks just as big cars. They have a very unique situation. They're highly regulated. The roadway is their workplace. In fact, the American Trucking Association came out a couple of years ago with a proposal. They recommended that the federal fuel tax be increased by 25 cents. Having good roadways and smooth flowing roadways is very important. But what we have learned is a single rate approach will certainly not work for trucks. There are so many different types of trucks. They have different operation and business plans, and their weights can vary by quite a bit. But what we have found, and this is crucial, is we're going to need a holistic approach to MBUF. You can't just decide, well, we're going to put the burden of transportation financing on the trucks. And the reason I mention that has been brought up. Some states are looking at that. Some of the folks in Congress have said, well, let's just increase the taxes on trucks and the like. That's really not going to accomplish much other than perhaps increase the cost of our goods, because any additional cost will be passed on to the consumer. So we're trying to take what I would call this holistic approach. Let's come up with a fair and equitable division between cars and trucks, and if and when we do MBUF, and take it from there. And in doing so, we've had several truck pilots. The one that was just completed in March of this year was truly a national truck pilot. We had 221 trucks over 6 months. And these trucks were headquartered in different states, not even along the eastern seaboard, but these trucks drove in all 48 states, and they drove almost 9 million miles during that 6-month period. So another reason why you can't treat trucks as if they're just big cars. They travel more, and they travel more, and they have some very unique features. So we are trying to move with that more holistic approach. Finally, another major issue is how much is this going to cost, the admin? Fuel tax is very cheap to administer. It's really not collected at the pump. You're just, when you pay for your gas, you're just reimbursing the gas station owner who's already paid the fuel tax, because it's collected at either the wholesale level for the feds or the wholesale and the distributor level for the state. So that fuel tax has been paid for long before it goes in the car. About 1 to 2% of the total revenues collected goes to admin. We're afraid that MBUF will probably cost more in terms of admin, at least at first. There's the account manager costs, the oversight, data linkages, what are DMV processes, the compliance and enforcement activities will probably be much greater with MBUF, in which the ongoing education outreach that I mentioned. Finally, I do want to mention that MBUF is actually becoming real. Oregon implemented their Origo system about 4 or 5 years ago. It's a volunteer system. It is now in place such that EVs, vehicles that get over 40 miles per gallon, while they have to pay an increased registration fee, they can get out of that registration and opt into the MBUF system. Their rate is 1.8 cents per mile. Utah, about 2 years ago, implemented a similar system. EVs, PHEVs, and hybrids may opt into this MBUF system at 1.5 cents per mile in lieu of paying an additional registration fee. In Utah, there's a cap, which means your MBUF amount will never exceed what that additional registration fee. And then Virginia has a volunteer MBUF system that is under development with a planned July 1st, 2022 start date. So I think I've used up all my time, and so there's my contact information. Excuse me. If you want more information on what the coalition has been doing, there's the website for the MBUF work that has been done by the coalition. Has fact sheets, has final reports, has other tech memos, has FAQs, and a whole bunch of really interesting information. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. And now we are going to go to any questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just go up to the mic. Carla.
I'm curious, how is this MBUF system being received in the dysfunctional Washington crowd?
Well, they're not so dysfunctional that they didn't pass the FAST Act with that section that allowed for those grants. So that they are on board with at least looking into it as a possibility. The current infrastructure bill, of course, as you all know, this changes from seems day to day what the infrastructure bill has or doesn't have. But last I checked, the infrastructure bill continues that surface transportation system funding alternatives program for another 5 years. So they're still looking at it. You know, it's one thing to investigate and come up with reports. It's another thing to actually implement it. Some of the earlier versions of the infrastructure bill had a national pilot in there. I don't know if that'll get back in or not. But right now, the feds have been very, very, at least supportive with that 50% match. And I think the next infrastructure bill makes it only a 30% match from the state DOTs and a 70% match from the feds. So I gotta give credit to the feds. They're the ones who really have helped push the analysis and the pilots.
I have a question for Mark. I'm curious as the makeup of the engineering and transportation planning profession diversifies itself as more women and minorities, join the planning and engineering. Has there been any consideration that we're doing a better job, at the local level with equity analysis and environmental justice, or is it so systemic that it really isn't making a difference? Again, the diversity of our professions.
Well, thanks for the question. I could refer you to this great issue of TR News on that very subject. There are a bunch of optimistic articles in there. I haven't observed a tremendous amount of progress. I work closely with a Title VI environmental justice advocacy group that has a lot of problems. But in the universe of federal agencies, US DOT actually ranks pretty well in terms of equity, issues, and the transportation world generally actually ranks pretty well, especially in regard to people with disabilities. There are a lot of other agencies that rank far worse, such as EPA and agriculture. Tom Sanchez and I do discuss some of these issues in our book that dates back to 2012 on the planning profession generally, in which we talk a lot more about these issues in the planning profession.
All right, any more questions? I actually have one question for Lou. I think you brought up a good point about the challenge of implementing a mileage-based user fee system, and I was curious if there's been any research into leveraging like connected vehicle technology and some system at gas stations that could like download the mileage and make it a regular payment as opposed to one lump sum.
Some folks, California is looking at that, at such an approach of not only gas stations, but also charging stations. Now, that doesn't, if you do it at public charging stations, that doesn't address how you would charge people who charge at home. But that is being looked at. I think the major concern with that is the amount of gas stations and charging stations you would have to equip with the hardware to read the pump and the like. But yeah, there are some pilots that are saying, well, what would this involve? Could we do it at the gas pump? One of the gentlemen who was on the California RUC board that when they were doing their students had a great saying, and I think it is telling of the challenge ahead for MBUF. And he says something he said that MBUF won't be ready for prime time until it's as easy as saying $10 on pump number 5. And that's sort of our goal. That's why we're hoping that in-vehicle technology will work. Maybe these state-based annual safety inspections with odometer readings might work. Maybe getting data from the insurance companies, because that is the use-based insurance, many of which use that same sort of plug-in device. By the way, you can't split an OBD2. We tried it, and it doesn't work. You can buy splitters, but it doesn't. So yes, that is being looked at, but there are some concerns with the cost of how much it would cost to retrofit all that infrastructure.
Thanks. All right, any other questions? All right, let's give one more round of applause for all our speakers. Thanks.
Thank you all.